A massive stone bowl in the heart of Rome always astonishes those who see it for the first time. On one side, the structure appears whole and incredibly powerful, rising above the city with a multi-story wall. But just a few steps around it, and the view changes dramatically. A large section of the outer wall is missing, revealing inner corridors and empty spans. Looking at these jagged edges, it's hard to imagine that the amphitheater was once a perfectly symmetrical and enclosed ring. Today, only an island of its former grandeur remains, resembling a broken toy against the backdrop of modern streets. People often attribute this to natural aging, but behind every empty niche and missing block lies a specific event. Where exactly did these millions of tons of heavy stone go? And why did one side endure while the other turned to ruins, remains the main mystery of this place. We will attempt to reconstruct the chain of events and understand how the greatest structure in human history began to literally melt before the eyes of the city's residents. To grasp the scale of the loss, one must momentarily imagine the Colosseum in its original form. It was not just an arena for spectacles, but a true symbol of imperial power. Construction of this giant began in 70 AD and took only 8 years. An incredibly short time even by modern standards. Imagine thousands of workers daily delivering massive blocks of white stone to the site. The building was entirely clad in light-colored slabs that shone so brightly in the sun they dazzled passers-by. In those days, the amphitheater did not look like gray ruins. It resembled a sparkling white mountain in the middle of the city. Remarkably, the builders used no cement or glue to join the outer walls. Heavy stone blocks were simply placed on top of each other, relying on their own weight and perfect edge alignment. To prevent the structure from shifting, special grooves were made inside the stones, and powerful iron rods were inserted. These clamps stitched the building together from the inside, creating an invisible metal framework. About 300 tons of valuable iron were used, which centuries later would become the target of a real hunt. Inside, everything was arranged even more luxuriously. Seats for the nobility were lined with pure marble, and realistic statues of gods stood in each arch. On hot days, a massive fabric dome was stretched over the stands to protect 50,000 spectators from the scorching rays. The Colosseum was created as an eternal object meant to outlive the ages, but that did not happen. When the southern wall collapsed, the Colosseum ceased to be a state property and turned into a sort of no-man's land. This marked the beginning of one of the strangest periods in its history. The enormous empty arches, once entrances for the crowds, began to transform into ordinary living spaces. Imagine walking through Rome at that time and seeing clothes hanging inside the greatest monument of antiquity, smoke rising from makeshift chimneys, and animals roaming the arena. This was not a one-time action by the homeless. Inside the amphitheater, a full-fledged urban quarter emerged with its own streets and rules. People built wooden floors inside the stone vaults, dividing the high spans into 2 or 3 levels. These became makeshift apartments, where a forge or cobbler's workshop might occupy the ground floor, while the master's family lived above. Records from that time show that these spaces were officially rented out and even sold. Influential city families owned entire sectors of the Colosseum, much like shopping malls today. Inside the arches, there were not only homes but also warehouses, stables, and even small churches. The arena, where gladiators once fought, was filled with soil and turned into a vast communal garden. Residents grew vegetables and fruits there, using the ancient walls as protection from the wind. In those years, the Colosseum resembled a giant anthill, with life bustling in every surviving corner. Instead of emperors and senators, children ran up and down its stairs. And instead of the roar of wild beasts, the sound of hammers and the lowing of cattle could be heard. This coexistence did not benefit the building. To make their apartments cozier, people broke new doorways and windows into the ancient walls, compromising the structure's integrity. They used marble slabs from the stands as countertops, or construction debris to patch holes in the floor. The amphitheater gradually lost its appearance, becoming encrusted with brick and mud extensions. It was during this period that the building suffered the most chaotic destruction. While official authorities carted away stones, ordinary residents gradually wore it down from the inside, adapting the great architecture for their modest needs. To a medieval person, the Colosseum was not a monument, but a very convenient rock with ready-made caves that were dry and safe to live in. This domestic colonization continued for centuries, and it is precisely because of this that the internal corridors today appear so jagged and uneven. Later, when people began to be evicted from the amphitheater for its preservation, archaeologists found remnants of chimneys and even traces of medieval kitchens literally embedded in the ancient concrete. In the 11th century, one influential Roman family even turned the amphitheater into their personal fortress, bricking up many spans. This saved part of the structure, but not for long. As soon as the city's power changed, the new owners decided that the Colosseum was too expensive a luxury and better used as a source of building stone. This began the era historians call the official dismantling. Here lies one of the most interesting facts. The removal of stone was not pure theft. It was a well-oiled state machine. There were specific contracts allowing contractors to take a certain number of blocks in exchange for a share of the profits or services for the city. A vast square filled with debris formed where the southern wall had collapsed. People called this place a stone forest. Each block was numbered and prepared for transport. If you were in Rome 500 years ago, you would see an endless line of ox-drawn carts slowly hauling parts of the Colosseum to new construction sites. It resembled the gradual disappearance of a giant that could no longer resist. One of the most famous routes of these carts was the Tiber River. There, ancient blocks were used to build port facilities and reinforce the banks to protect the city from seasonal floods. The most astonishing use of the stone occurred in the construction of the Palazzo Venezia. This magnificent building in the city's center is almost entirely made from recycled Colosseum materials. Its foundation, massive outer walls, and even internal floors were created from the same white stone that once served as the amphitheater's facade. When you look at its powerful walls, you are essentially seeing the missing southern wall, just in a different form. The stones did not disappear without a trace. They simply changed addresses. The same happened with the Palazzo Barberini. There was even a saying that what the early medieval invaders could not destroy, the Barberini gradually dismantled. This aristocratic family, with the Pope's permission, removed so much material that it would have sufficed to build an entire quarter. But few know that parts of the Colosseum traveled much further than these famous palaces. For example, huge travertine blocks were used in the construction of St. Peter's Basilica, the most important church in the Catholic world. To transport the heavy stones there, special temporary bridges had to be built, and roads reinforced to bear the weight of the ancient blocks. Even the famous Ponte Cestio, crossed by thousands daily, contains pieces of the Colosseum's stands, securely hidden beneath a layer of later cladding. The recycling process was not always careful. While large blocks found new life, smaller fragments and decorative details met a different fate. Along the roads leading from the amphitheater, special kilns operated. They burned exquisite marble capitals, statues, and slabs to turn them into lime. This was the cheapest way to obtain quality mortar for ordinary brick houses. Priceless marble was converted into lime mortar for new churches and palaces. Huge volumes of elite marble turned into dust and construction adhesive. This explains why today we see only a rough concrete skeleton inside the building. Everything of any value was either incorporated into new buildings or burned in kilns for practical gain. Thus, the Colosseum did not simply vanish. It was methodically dismantled and integrated into the very fabric of modern Rome. The city literally grew from the remnants of its greatest symbol, turning a historical monument into a foundation for new life. But why did people so persistently dismantle this particular building? The answer is simple: quality. The ancient Romans used such dense and high-quality limestone in its construction that it only grew stronger over time. Working with it was a pleasure, and buildings made from it stood forever. At the time, the concept of historical value did not exist in the modern sense. For the residents of that era, the Colosseum was a relic of a dark pagan past, useful only as a material depot. It was even used to make stairs in ordinary residential houses. To this day, in the basements of old Roman buildings, one can find characteristic curved blocks that were clearly once part of the stands or corridors of the arena. Interestingly, it wasn't just the stone that attracted treasure hunters. The most valuable resource within the walls remained the very iron that once held the blocks together. This marked the beginning of the Great Plundering Era, when people deliberately chipped away at the walls to extract the metal clamps. If you look at the Colosseum today, you'll notice it's covered with thousands of holes. Many think these are traces of old shells or bullets, but they are not. Each hole is the mark of a medieval metal hunter. People extracted the iron rods and melted them down into horseshoes, knives, or tools. There was so much iron that its extraction became a true urban industry. It was dangerous and hard work. Metal workers used special long drills made of steel. They sensed where the metal connections were within the stone and drilled a path to them. Sometimes blocks cracked and fell, leading to tragic incidents. But the desire for profit was stronger than fear. Each extracted piece of metal made the structure weaker and weaker. The building lost its internal core and began to literally crumble under its own weight. From a closed ring, the Colosseum gradually transformed into the horseshoe shape we know today. People of that time saw nothing wrong with this. They simply used the old for the needs of the new, unaware they were destroying the greatest architectural monument. At some point, the amphitheater began to be surrounded by urban legends and mysterious stories that frightened passers-by. Local legends imbued the empty corridors with a mystical atmosphere, attributing them to the past. Stories circulated about strange sounds emanating from the gaps in the walls at night. This slightly slowed the building's dismantling by ordinary people, but did not stop the church and aristocrats. They continued to carve out the best pieces of marble to adorn their villas. One report from that time mentions that 40 carts of pure white marble were taken at once to decorate a private fountain. This was a time when the Colosseum was literally melting under the scorching Italian sun, transforming from a round giant into the very torn horseshoe we know today. But the building was yet to face another unexpected twist of fate, turning it from a quarry into a sanctuary. The most surprising event occurred in the 16th century, when the Colosseum unexpectedly found a new patron. By then, the building resembled not an arena but an abandoned forest. Trees grew within its spans, and the walls were covered with rare plant species that botanists studied as a separate ecosystem. The building was literally dying, and locals began using it as a dump. Then Pope Benedict I intervened. He made a brilliant move, which today would be called a great PR move. To stop the looting, he declared the Colosseum a site of Christian martyrdom. Modern historians note that there is insufficient direct evidence of mass executions, specifically in the Colosseum. However, the status of a shrine helped protect the walls. In an instant, the Colosseum transformed from a free quarry into an open-air church. Crosses were installed on the walls, and stone theft was equated with desecration of a holy site. This was the first time in history that ancient buildings began to be protected, not for their beauty, but out of fear of divine wrath. Thanks to this prohibition, we can see at least half of the facade today. Without this religious shield, the last stones of the Colosseum would have long since become someone's foundation or fence. However, even after the introduction of protection, the building continued to surprise. In the 19th century, when the first scientific excavations began, archaeologists discovered an entire system of elevators and trapdoors beneath the arena. These mechanisms allowed wild animals and scenery to be suddenly raised onto the stage, creating a magical effect. It's hard for the listener to imagine that beneath the floor where people walked lay a complex technical system where hundreds of workers ensured the games ran smoothly. These underground levels were preserved much better than the outer walls because they were buried under debris and soil for years, preserving them for history. Today, when we look at the empty eye sockets of the arches, we understand that the other half of the Colosseum did not disappear into thin air. It simply dissolved into Rome itself. It is in the stones of St. Peter's Basilica, in the bridges over the Tiber, and in the bricks of private villas. The city literally absorbed its main attraction to rebuild itself anew. For a long time, people could not understand why the Colosseum crumbled so strangely and selectively. If you look at it from a bird's-eye view, you will see an almost perfect line of separation. On one side, a monolithic wall. On the other, picturesque ruins. Rumors circulated for a long time that this was the work of higher powers punishing the city for the harsh and brutal spectacles of the past. But scientists, armed with modern instruments, found a much more down-to-earth and logical explanation. It turned out that it all depended on what the giant structure stood upon. When ancient engineers chose the construction site, they made a fatal error that was impossible to see with the naked eye. The main problem was that the building's foundation was initially trapped. The amphitheater was erected on the side of an old, drained lake, and the ground beneath it was very treacherous. Under the northern part of the amphitheater, which has been best preserved, lies a dense layer of limestone. This is practically natural concrete, which holds the foundation firmly and prevents it from moving. However, the southern side, where there is now a huge gap, was once a body of water. The builders drained it and poured a deep concrete foundation, but nature proved trickier. It turned out that the enormous structure, weighing hundreds of thousands of tons, rested one side on a solid base and the other literally on a soft cushion. Over centuries, the soft soil under the southern wall turned into something akin to a sponge. With each earthquake, the northern part stood firm, while the southern began to vibrate and shift. Sooner or later, it was bound to crack right in the middle. The first serious test occurred in the mid-5th century, when a powerful earthquake shook Rome. The city's walls cracked, and houses turned to dust. Dangerous fissures first appeared in the Colosseum then, and the southern side began to slowly sink. Authorities tried to patch the cracks, but restoring its former strength was impossible. The structure began to resemble a wounded beast awaiting the final blow. This precarious state lasted for hundreds of years while the building was still maintained. But after the fall of the great empire, the amphitheater was neglected, and it began to slowly deteriorate on its own. The true end of the old Colosseum came in September 1349. That year, a catastrophic earthquake struck Italy, turning everything upside down. The tremors continued for several days, and the southern outer wall, standing on weak ground, simply gave way. Thousands of tons of elite stone crashed to the ground, filling the square with massive debris. In an instant, the perfect ring of the amphitheater was torn apart. This event completely changed people's attitudes toward the monument. If it was once feared or respected, it now became a giant dump of free building materials. Citizens realized they no longer needed to travel to distant quarries and spend money on stone extraction, when ready-made, perfectly hewn blocks lay at their feet. This was the point of no return, after which the building began to be dismantled piece by piece. Anyone could bring a cart and take part of history home to build a shed or reinforce a fence. But stones were not the only treasure for the takers. As we've mentioned, the metal in the walls was an equally coveted prize. Interestingly, it was this earthquake that created the strange appearance we see on all postcards. The northern side, standing on solid rock, withstood all the blows and remained tall and majestic. The southern side turned into a low stump, exposing its inner corridors. Today, the Colosseum is the largest puzzle in the world, which the best engineers and historians on the planet are trying to piece together. If you approach the building closely, you'll notice something strange. In places where the outer wall breaks off, there are huge brick buttresses. They looked like massive patches on an old coat. These reinforcements were built in the 19th century because, without them, the surviving part of the building would have collapsed following the missing half. This was the first large-scale restoration in history, when people realized that if they didn't intervene now, the symbol of the Eternal City would turn into a pile of rubble. But the most surprising thing is happening right now. Modern Rome is a bustling metropolis with subways, buses, and millions of tourists. And this is the main problem for the ancient stones. Every time a subway train rushes underground, the Colosseum feels a slight vibration. For a person, this is almost imperceptible, but for the heavy stone blocks no longer bound by iron clamps, it's a nightmare. The building literally breathes, and these microscopic movements gradually widen old cracks. To monitor this, scientists have installed hundreds of highly sensitive sensors on the walls. They record every movement of the stone in real time. It's like the cardiogram of an old giant, whose health is watched by the whole world. Recently, researchers decided to conduct a unique experiment to see if the Colosseum could be restored to its original form. The idea sounded enticing, but engineers quickly faced harsh reality. It turned out that modern materials are simply incompatible with ancient stone. If the voids were filled with modern concrete, it would expand and contract with temperature differently than ancient limestone, tearing the walls apart from within. Therefore, restorers chose another path. They cleaned the facade of soot and smog using special lasers. These beams gently removed the layer of dirt without damaging the stone itself. Under the black crust of dust, the same light color seen by Romans 2,000 years ago is revealed. Interestingly, the missing half of the Colosseum still occasionally makes its presence felt. During repairs of old houses in central Rome, workers often find massive blocks with characteristic holes for those very iron clamps. Instead of discarding them, city authorities try to return such finds. Of course, placing them back in the wall is impossible, but they are laid around the arena as a reminder of former grandeur. This creates a strange sensation. You walk through the city and realize it is literally infused with pieces of the amphitheater. You might drink coffee in a cafe whose foundation was laid with stones that witnessed gladiatorial battles. Is there a mystical connection between the preservation of the Colosseum and the fate of Rome itself? There is an ancient prophecy that says, "As long as the Colosseum stands, so shall Rome. When the Colosseum falls, so shall the world." It sounds ominous, but there is a grain of truth in this phrase. For us, this building has become a measure of our ability to preserve history. We cannot return the half stolen by time and people, but we have learned to value what remains today. The Colosseum is not just ruins, but the most valuable real estate in Italy, bringing billions to the treasury. It turns out that even in a semi-ruined state, it is far more useful and valuable than any modern building. The mystery of the disappearance of half the Colosseum is revealed. It was consumed by need, greed, and harsh geology. But it is precisely this imperfection, these jagged edges and empty spans, that make it so recognizable. If it had survived intact, it might look like an ordinary concrete stadium. But in its current form, it tells a story of survival. We see not just architecture, but traces left by time and people, making it truly alive. The story of the disappearance of half the Colosseum is a vivid example of how humanity's greatest creations bow before the power of nature and the pragmatism of descendants. A process that began with a geological error and destructive earthquakes turned the amphitheater into a giant construction donor for the needs of a new Rome. Today, its parts are not just erased by time, but continue to live in the masonry of churches, palaces, and bridges we walk on every day. The jagged edges of the walls are not just signs of ruin, but unique evidence of how the city repurposed its past for the future. Although the building survived only halfway, it is these open wounds on the stone that made it an eternal symbol, reminding us of the fragility of civilization and the relentless march of time.